All right. So everybody's in for a treat today. I'll go ahead and introduce our two lovely guests. First, we have Dr. Emmons Blanford. Hopefully I said that right. She's an assistant teaching professor and field experience director and dual enrollment faculty mentor in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice. Um, She is also also on the Diversity Council for the Division of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And while in this capacity, she's helped develop the Equity Action Initiative. Presently, she serves on the Attraction, Retention, and Engagement Committee, where she is, along with her colleagues, continuing to develop initiatives and best practices for mentoring underserved and underrepresented minority groups at Florida International and in the community. We also have Dr. Vincent Robinson, who is the Assistant Dean of the Stephen Green School of International and Public Affairs and a teaching professor, also in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice. In her capacity as Assistant Dean, she oversees all curriculum and course accessibility concerns, including universal design for learning, as well as those issues pertaining to faculty credentialing, student services, accreditation, DE&I initiatives, among other responsibilities. She also continues to expand awareness of and deepen others' understanding of the impacts of racism and diversity-led initiatives by facilitating unit-specific implied bias, microaggressions, and bystander intervention training, education, and others about strategies for recruiting, hiring, and retaining people of color as employees and hosting webinars, panels, and podcasts addressing modern civil rights. So if we would give, first of all, both of our presenters today a hand. And I will turn it over to you, ladies.
I'm like, okay, so who's going first? Well, thank you, Deontay, for those amazing introductions. It's always kind of awkward to hear somebody like read your bio. It's like you don't know whether to smile or just kind of stand there. It's kind of like, okay. But thank you so much. Both myself and my esteemed colleague are very excited. We're happy to be here. This is my first introduction to BDN, so I'm really, really excited. And so what we want to do today, and we kind of have a more formal presentation, but if it's more advantageous to kind of make it informal and just kind of engage in dialogue, I think we're both open to that as well. Whatever it's most beneficial for you all is totally fine by us. But we just wanted to kind of discuss the issues surrounding like the anti-woke legislation. That's something that I've recently become very interested in, living in the wonderful state of Florida. And so, we're my colleague says this a lot, and I totally agree with her sentiments. She says we are building a plane while trying to fly it. So we haven't crashed, at least not yet. So we just want to kind of engage in dialogue and just kind of tell you our experience with this legislation presently. So, where we are. Dr. Vincent.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for allowing us to facilitate this conversation. The state of Florida, Governor DeSantis has a strong interest in rewriting history, in changing the way that we approach education, limiting what people can and can't discuss in their classrooms, and this is K through 12, as well as within the university setting. And currently his focus is on things that are related to race, to gender, to national origin. But there's no reason to think that his mission isn't going to continue, or that he's not going to continue with his mission, rather, and continue to expand what we are permitted to discuss in all of our classrooms and engage in academic discourse. And that's how we perceive the challenges that have been presented to us as an attack on academic freedom, of course, but that we are perhaps being hindered or prohibited and in actually engaging students in the discourse, which is what the whole purpose of higher education is. So the legislation in particular, HB 7, is now a Board of Governors regulation that all of the institutions in the state university system have. And it's called the Stop Wrongs Against Our Kids and Employee Act. That's the Stop Woke Act. The governor does not want us to be woke, apparently. And the idea here is that they're censoring, the bill is censoring what both educators and what students can discuss in the classroom. In anything that's related to race or in gender right now, particularly in the higher education classrooms. Dr. Blanford, are you going to share your screen?
I surely can. Hold on just a second. Oh my goodness. Hold on 1 second. Let's try this one more time. That obviously did not work. Okay, let's try this again. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Yay. All right, so Dr. Vincent gave a great introduction, and I obviously don't want to condescend or be presumptuous, but I wanted to kind of give a brief explanation, I guess, of kind of anti-woke. So she's already told us what the acronym for. The acronym is for, so when I think of anti-woke, I think of this body of legislation that seeks to get rid of what is considered, and I'm using this term very loosely at this point, divisive content, right? So this notion that there are certain things that we can't discuss again surrounding race and gender and color and nation of origin. And of course, we're seeing it play out literally right now in Florida. And I can tell you from a personal perspective, and I've discussed this with Dr. Vincent as well as some other colleagues, and this was one of the reasons why we really were passionate about speaking and kind of engaging in dialogue, is because, to be completely honest with you, I don't know if you can tell, but I am one who I'm very passionate, and I'm also incredibly animated. I love what I do. I love teaching. I love my students. And immediately I thought, oh my gosh, this may be potentially problematic for me. One, because most of the research that I have done has been in the space of race and crime. And in addition to that, the courses that I tend to teach and that I'm most passionate about at the undergraduate level, it's race and crime. And at the graduate level, it's minorities and crime. So I'm immediately like, oh my gosh, what can I say? What can I say? How does this impact my classroom? Do I even want to continue teaching these particular courses? What about my students? Because I'm so passionate and because I am so animated, I immediately think, oh my gosh, whatever I say, it's probably going to be perceived, if someone doesn't necessarily agree with my stance, that I'm endorsing something, even though I may not necessarily be endorsing it. And we're seeing this happen all over the country. And not that I am a proponent or trying to turn this into a political conversation, or that I'm endorsing any political party in particular, but there's been a lot of whispers that our governor may have his eyes set on the White House. So because of this legislation and what's happening in Florida and other states, we may see it being implemented on a much larger, more pervasive scale. So, we wanted to talk about this because, like my colleague said, there are issues of, okay, well, how does this support academic freedom, or does this impede us, or is this one step on the way to censorship? Think about the mass exodus. If you have teachers, instructors like myself who are very passionate, who really enjoy what they do, Dr. Vincent is, she is she's my shero, but she's a powerhouse in the classroom. Like she really is. She's a powerhouse in the classroom. But if you have these people that are really passionate about being in the classroom, being engaged, engaging their students in critical analysis, and presenting some of these concepts that may be seen as provocative, you may have a mass exodus of teachers that are like, you know what, this is too much. And either they're refusing to teach certain classes, or perhaps they're like, you know what, let me take my aim at another field. And we know that this is exacerbated for Black and Brown folks who often feel that they are undervalued and underappreciated in higher ed anyways. So also just engaging in discourse about how do we balance this legislation and still ensure that our students are prepared to go out into the world to ensure that they are still well-rounded, you know? So there's a lot to discuss here. And I know a lot of, there are people on both sides of this. There are people that are like, you know, you're making a big deal. It's much ado about nothing. But I submit that there's a lot here that needs to be discussed.
Dr. Blanford, before we move on, I realized we didn't show them the statute. We didn't show them the language. Let's go backwards just a minute. And let me tell you what specifically the legislation is doing. It defines the ascription of blame for certain historical and contemporary inequities to any one group based on race, color, sex, or national origin as discriminatory. So what this means for us, if you have a discussion about privilege, you are no longer permitted to say as a blanket statement that there are certain groups that benefit from privilege that is given to them based on the color of their skin or based on their gender. And on the other side, obviously, you can no longer say that an individual, by virtue of the color of their skin or gender, may find themselves in an oppressed position. So those of us who study race and ethnic relations, we're having some trouble understanding this, because if the push is to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion, that inclusion, which naturally requires you to admit that there are differences in how people are being treated, then this legislation now contradicts what they say they want us to do. Because now you can no longer state those inequities, discuss those inequities in a certain fashion within the classroom. And that's why it's becoming particularly problematic for us. So historical issues, contemporary inequities, if we say that there's blame, and what the governor was referring to is, you can't make someone feel guilty for benefiting from privilege that they earned through their ancestors. So white privilege, you cannot say that white individuals benefit from privilege by virtue of their ancestry. You cannot say that in the United States, a person who is Black or brown naturally is going to be oppressed by virtue of the privilege that other people have. And if you're going to say that, there, you have to provide that information in a particular context, which we haven't had to do for quite some time. So that's what the issue is. The universities are scrambling because a student can bring a cause of action saying that a faculty member has made me feel uncomfortable and blame me for whatever my white family did or whatever experiences my Black family have had. So the student has a cause of action against the university, against the faculty member. And the problem is that having a cause of action that's based on something that is completely subjective and tying taxpayer dollars, meaning the legislation allows for the state to withhold millions of dollars in funding to universities who do not have a process in place to help resolve these issues, bring them to whatever the resolution is. So here we have a situation where now you can't talk about, we're going to talk about that later. In the grand scheme of things, they're putting parameters for you and whether or not you can talk about things such as privilege, such as oppression, such as race, gender, those types of things. They're establishing parameters for you. And if you violate those rules that have now been put in place, what does that mean for you in terms of your career? And if the university does not sufficiently punish you for engaging in certain actions, then the university could be can find itself in pretty difficult fiscal positions. So how do we deal with that? How do we address that? That's really what we're looking at here. Dr. Blanford. So if you look at this slide, I think the numbers have actually gone up. It's a little bit higher than that now, that there are efforts in now 42 states to restrict education on racism, bias, and the contributions of specific racial or ethnic groups to US history or related topics. This is why in the very beginning, I referenced the idea of whitewashing American history. So one of the things that we're seeing in the K through 12 system is that this legislation would essentially allow for information to be taken out of history books because the governor believes that we live in a post-racial society where race is no longer of importance in the state of Florida, and that everyone is given a fair shot, which that's going to bring up the DEI part of the conversation. But he says, hey, as long as you pull yourself up by your bootstraps, we're all good. So this is an attack that we see on, of course, critical race theory, which has been the biggest issue that he's had. But this stance that he has on race no longer matters in the state of Florida or in this country, and how naive of a statement that is, and that it denies the very existence of many people who come into this country. So it's all over the United States. You see it everywhere. I can't even say it's focused in the South. It's all over the country. And this is only 36 of them, and there are 6 more states that can be added to this list. In terms of future implications, Dr. Blanford, go ahead.
Okay, in terms of future implications, and I don't know how many of you, I would imagine you probably have seen where now, most recently, as yesterday, you have this fight for this notion of affirmative action and this notion of, well, everything should be based on merit. And even, taking, again, as Dr. Vincent said, taking the race out of it, right? And for those of us who have, and I hate to make a sweeping generalization because we're about to talk about that in just a second, so I don't want to make a sweeping generalization, but just humor me. We know that historically, most of us have probably experienced some form of racism, and it may have impeded our ability somewhere in our educational tenure, but you have, because of this attempt to whitewash and sort of rewrite history and to say that we are living in a post racist society where race or even gender no longer matter, then there's also the push to say, okay, any policies or legislation that was put in place to kind of address these disparities are no longer applicable, because now we are getting into reverse racism.
And something for Dr. Mason in particular, in Florida, the governor is really trying to control the use of certain textbooks in K through 12. And if the examples within a textbook reference race, and he doesn't like the reference that's being made, they're pulling those textbooks. We can't work with those publishers anymore. An example that they gave was a math problem in a calculus book that referenced differences among various races. And he said that that was contributing to making us a very divisive society. So if it's Cengage or Pearson or Sage or Oxford University Press or whomever, and that text is used within K through 12, then he can block every school board from using that specific textbook. So it's not just affecting us at the university level, it's all through K through 12. He does not want an emphasis, apparently, on African-American history because it's divisive. and that's not where we are anymore. We have moved past all of those things, but it's denying the existence of the history. That's where we're finding the problems.
So the question becomes, and this is something that Dr. Vincent and we've discussed extensively, how best do we adhere to these legislative mandates while simultaneously still wanting, to teach and engage our students in a way that is productive, in a way that causes them to, engage in critical thinking, that causes them to say, okay, let me, it's kind of an epiphany, so to speak. And I told you before, I'm very animated, and I'll just tell you on a personal note, and Dr. Vincent, of course, knows this. There, some of the courses that I teach that are, dare I say it, my favorite courses to teach, I have considered not teaching them any longer. Not because I don't still have the desire, but because I don't necessarily want to say I'm fearful. But there's legitimate concern about this legislation, about what that means for my career in academia, about someone potentially saying that I said a statement that made them feel guilty, or made them, I think one of the phrases that's used is like psychological distress. And even in my my best efforts, I can, I was like, oh my gosh, what if I make someone, I hate to say, use an urban colloquialism here, but feel some type of way. What if I make someone feel bad, or and not even intentionally doing so. And I strongly considered, okay, do I want to stay in the classroom? Do I want to teach these courses? Do I want to have one foot on each side of the house, just to kind of have that stability and that guarantee, especially when at this particular point, we haven't been given any, assurance in terms of, okay, if this happens, what are the next courses? Does that mean we lose our job? And what we've consistently been told is, well, you're going to have to wait and see. You're going to have to wait and see when someone has a complaint that that is founded. You'll just have to see how it plays out, and from there we can kind of give more guidance. But of course, being a person in the classroom and asking, okay, well, what protection do I have as someone who talks about race and crime and gender and things of that nature pertaining to the justice system? How does that impact me? And so, we kind of started to have this discussion around, okay, well, what does that look like? What can I do? What can I do? What should I do? What shouldn't I do? So we wanted to take a couple of moments just to kind of talk about, because the whole idea with this legislation is that you cannot endorse that a particular race or a particular sex is privileged, right? Or not to make them feel bad. But at the same time, which is interesting, it's like, well, you can't endorse it, but you can still discuss it, right? And then sometimes that line can be, depending on who you're talking to, right? That line can be like razor thin, because again, you're discussing it, but you're like, okay, someone else may perceive it as me endorsing it. So one of the ways around that is that we have to make sure that we are remaining neutral. And for me, this is a difficult one because again, it's the animation. I think it's I'm very in your face. I'm very exuberant, so to speak. But we have to make sure that we are remaining neutral. We can't make sweeping generalizations. We can't oversimplify. Like, for example, with me and my course on race and crime, I can't just make a blanket statement regarding why there are, in the past, I probably would have said something to the extent of the preponderance of research strongly suggests that systemic racism has contributed to why there are more Black and brown folks being incarcerated at much higher rates than their white counterparts, right? But now, because we can't oversimplify, and because we don't want our students to believe that we are trying to indoctrinate them or push a certain agenda, we have to make sure that we are providing an alternate perspective. So yes, race may contribute, or there are researchers that say that race may contribute to crime or systemic racism, but there are other researchers that imply, whatever. So we have to make sure that we are not endorsing any particular viewpoint. We have to make sure that, and we have our students do this all the time, right? We tell them, if you make a statement, that we want your statement supported by empirical evidence, that we want, what is, you're giving these assertions, but we need you to back it up. So we kind of have to, and to be honest with you, this isn't something that I've done in a really long time. I tend to, because this is something I've taught for a moment and also research, I can rattle off the data relatively quickly, but I don't necessarily say where it's coming from. I no longer do it, to be honest. Now, I did it for my dissertation, and probably when I first started teaching, but I don't necessarily do it now. So the other thing in endorsing versus discussing, we're offering a multiple perspective, but we are also making sure that we are contextualizing our statements, and that we are saying, okay, we're giving a statement and it may be seen as controversial, but here is the information and here's the data so it's not Dr. Blanford has this opinion necessarily. This is what researchers have said. But again, we still have to provide multiple perspectives. We also have to work to provide a safe space for our students. I don't know if this happened to you, but I remember I'm originally from Tennessee. And I remember being in Tennessee, and I went to University of Tennessee, that a lot of my professors were white male, and their viewpoints were very conservative. And it was very evident that they had very conservative views. And so there were times when I kind of wanted to say something, but I was like, I don't want my grade to be adversely impacted, or I don't want them to make a side note, or, dock my grade on my paper because I have a viewpoint different from theirs. So it's very important that we provide a safe space that encourages dialogue, that says, hey, I understand we have a difference of opinions. You may not share the same opinion as your classmate, but we can still engage in academic discourse, and we can do so in a way that is productive, that is in a way that doesn't attack our peers. And we have to encourage students to arrive at their own conclusions, which is something that we should have been doing all along, right? So we prevent the information. This is what data shows us. This is one viewpoint, perhaps this is another viewpoint. And now what you can do as the student, and this obviously is something that we want our students to engage in critical analysis, and we want them to think for themselves, right? That's something that we want them to do in grade school and higher ed as well. So we encourage them now to arrive at their own conclusions, which is—
So that's only part of the issue, though, because yes, we are now being asked to do what we ask our students to do, but there's also something about our own expertise, our own lived experiences, which now come under criticism as being used to endorse, to indoctrinate, to inculcate, these are the words that are in the statute, to espouse various perceptions. So you can no longer just say that an individual should, or a group of individuals should receive a benefit or not receive a benefit by virtue of their race. So affirmative action is naturally going to come into the conversation. But as Dr. Blanford is explaining this idea of endorsing things versus discussing them, some of the examples that we got in our training is you cannot have a blanket statement that says Black people are oppressed in this country. You cannot say that. What you can do is ask students, what are the characteristics of oppression? What groups might feel as if they're being oppressed? What are some environmental factors that might impact whether somebody feels as if they are oppressed? But the blanket statement can no longer occur. You cannot say that racial color blindness is impossible because of implicit bias. We're not allowed to say things like that anymore. Now we have to have a conversation about these specific authors, these specific researchers say that color blindness is impossible. What are the tenets of their argument? What's important about their argument, which in the grand scheme of things isn't bad. However, some of what we're doing is actually engaging in microaggressions against the people that we say we want to protect, because it's negating people's experiences. I shouldn't have to go get a book to talk about race or gender, the benefits of either one, when I'm speaking about my own personal experience. It's the same catch-22 that because we have doctorates, we're objective. But when the issue is of race, we can no longer be objective. So we need to listen to somebody else who's more objective because they don't have the lived experience. So the lived experience helps to support our expertise, but is now being used against you because they're saying that you're going to use it to indoctrinate people, to inculcate people. A much simpler example that I was given that doesn't deal with race is that you can't have a statement that says that one person in a group possesses a characteristic that is better than another group. So the example they gave us, and this is going to sound weird, women are nurturers. That making that statement of women are nurturers is suggesting that women have the ability to nurture, but men do not, or do not have the same ability. That they're getting that deep into how we are phrasing everything in our classes. So by saying women are nurturers, my student can say that I'm stuck on gender, I'm stuck on women, and I don't acknowledge that males may also be nurturers. So they want us to take that language out altogether and say women may have disproportionate care roles. So it's now forcing you to really sit and think about every single statement that you make to a student because of the cause of action that can come as a result of that. You can't say, for example, men don't listen to women in staff meetings. Now you need to say, what are some of the power dynamics in staff meetings? Because stating that men don't listen is now discriminatory in nature. That's what the statute is saying. When we make these types of statements, that one group benefits and the other group does not, whether it's by race or gender, national origin, or whatever the issue, that we as the faculty members are engaging in discrimination against the student. And many of us have some difficulties with understanding how that amounts to discrimination. But that's what the statute says amounts to discrimination. Go ahead, Dr. Blanford.
So we also wanted to provide some suggestions in terms of what can be done. And I know that the title of today's workshop is dealing with how we can kind of stop what's going on. I mean, and when I say stop, I don't necessarily mean we may not be able to stop the legislative train from moving forward. But there are some things that we can do. So one of those suggestions is, that you, if you haven't already, or, once you graduate and you work for whatever various college or universities, for you to join the union. Also, another suggestion is for you to consult with your institutional leaders regarding, if you have, like with myself, right, and Dr. Vincent, we're currently going through this, so in involving and consulting with our institutional leaders, or sometimes, of course, Dr. Vincent is she is a dean. So, there are times where I say, hey, I have this idea, and I want to make sure that this still falls within the parameters of the legislation. So making sure that you're consulting with your institutional leaders. Another obvious one here is, vote, right? We want our voices to be heard. And if and again, this is not a political conversation, but if you don't espouse to these particular beliefs, or maybe you don't agree with this legislation, one of the ways that we can make our voices heard, obviously, is to vote. Another thing we can do is we can preface. I talked about that maybe 2 or 3 slides ago, but provide disclaimers. And this, I don't know, Dr. Vincent may disagree with me, but it still seems kind of interesting that I have to provide disclaimers, not just regarding where I perhaps received some information or some data from, but also, maybe even in our syllabi saying that, we may discuss some subjects dealing with race or color or sex, but that doesn't mean that you should feel guilty or that, we're trying to indoctrinate you. We're presenting those facts based on empirical research, and we're providing citations. And again, some of these things maybe you are presently doing, but for me, I'm having to work to be much more intentional about the things that I say, about how I say those particular things, and being much more conscious about how something may be perceived by the student. And previously, I kind of, and maybe incorrectly assumed, I'm not sure, that the student understood, where I was coming from, and that I wasn't necessarily trying to indoctrinate them, or that I was trying to push a specific agenda, or that I was intending to, make them feel guilty, or it's just about now prefacing and being much more intentional about what we say, what we do, what we write.
What's interesting about this also is that it's not limited just to the faculty member. It applies to everyone who is involved in the instruction of a student. So your guest speakers, now you need to censor them as well. You need to provide them with the parameters that the state has established so that they are not the target of a cause of action. This also applies to our employees. And if they have any trainings that they have to attend, you cannot make any of these types of statements in any training that is considered mandatory for employment or for licensure or for any type of certification. So it's caused us to pause on much of our DEI training because we have to rethink how we state every single sentence. Every single statement has to be rethought and has to be a little bit more intentional to ensure that no one feels that we are endorsing a specific point, inculcating, espousing, coercing them. That's another word that they're starting to use, to believe something. So a student may say, just as Dr. Blanford mentioned in her own academic career, that I believe this and my professor believes something else, but I know I have to write what my professor believes in order to get a good grade. So all of those things, seeing how they are starting to manifest itself. And if it seems like we're a little bit all over the place, it's because we are. And the reason we are is because this language, this statute is currently going through the litigation process. The Board of Governors that controls the state university system has clearly stated, we are not giving you any advice on how to do this for the next year. You're on your own. Go figure it out all by yourselves. And one of the institutions at some point in time will end up as the sacrificial lamb who will figure out that we did something wrong, that we did not do what we were supposed to do. But that causes a great deal of angst, anxiety, particularly for our non-tenured faculty, particularly for faculty who have not yet obtained tenure, because if you have a cause of action against you, the university has not even yet told us, does it stay in my personnel file? Does it follow me? Does it impede me from getting promoted to the next level? There's no information at all that has been released. We're literally, as she said, flying the plane as we build it. And that's troubling. That's really troubling, particularly for those of us who teach courses that are related to gender or to patriarchy or to race. That's a problem. Comparative politics, even comparative criminal justice system, she and I are in the same department. Once you start to talk about race, then you have to pump the brakes a little bit. We're not saying that you cannot talk about it. We're saying that you need to now reframe things in a different way. And that could be tied to student learning objectives. That could be tied to learning outcomes, to program outcomes. So it's not limited to Florida. We know that there are many, many other states who are now attacking higher education. We saw the map, obviously, but think about how this could really impact higher education as a whole throughout the entire nation, particularly if the governor ends up in the White House in a few years. He's working with other governors who are pushing the same agendas in their states, Texas being one of them. And of course, it's not going to be limited to these topics. Right now, it's limited to race and gender and national origin. But this is the same governor who has the Don't Say Gay bill. So this is, although he promotes it as the individual freedoms that everyone should have, he's distorting what individual freedom actually means.
I know that we are quickly approaching our time, and we did want to make it interactive, or at least give you guys an opportunity to kind of discuss the things. And I know, as Dr. Vincent said, and I'm glad that she that she let you know that we're kind of still figuring it out in terms of how this is going to work and what all of this looks like. But we did want to provide an opportunity for us to at least briefly engage in dialogue. So I wanted to open up the floor and just ask, as far as personal impact, does this shape what you will teach in your class? Does this shape what classes you will teach? Just what do you guys feel about the legislation as it currently stands?
My first thought is, how do they get away with this, as it completely opposes the First Amendment of freedom of speech, it seems, to where I can't teach what I want to teach in the manner.
I can give you a response to that.
Okay.
The governor recently stated that as employees of the state, of a state institution, we are agents of the state and agents of the government. Therefore, our syllabi, our curricula, none of it is free speech. We are operating as the government. So they have the right to control our speech. And we got to see the implications, right, of what this is going to do to education across the entire country.
Yeah. I mean, part of college is you get to choose what class you want to take. If you don't want to take the class that deals with it, don't take the class.
Anyone else?
Good afternoon again, all. I see a lot of implications across the board. The infrastructure of where all this is going has been put in place going back over 30 years ago with the introduction of charter schools. One of the things I wanted to say is that there's more than 36 states that have passed charter school laws for K through 12 education. And 90% of those educational management companies are owned by the white majority and Republicans. Part of the history of what is they have pushed money in all those states where they have converted from traditional public to charter schools. We have people like in my state of Michigan, Betsy DeVos, who was our former most recent Secretary of State, whose company founded was one of the first management companies to take over charter schools here in the state of Michigan. And they replicated that program and the legislation by pushing money through all these other states to get these things in place. So I would say to you, the infrastructure of a lot of public schools across the country is already there, with the influx of charter schools being ran by for-profit companies. There's a danger there. They've been planning it for 30 years. We're just getting the lid lifted off. We need to get woken up.
And
what you're saying to me is
what they don't want.
So what do we do? One of the things I've been doing, and I encourage all others, is find a seat on the table where you can minimize this type of legislation from happening. Placing yourself on school boards where decisions are made, utilizing your fraternities and sororities. All the national fraternities and sororities all have initiatives. We need to communicate and get them up to speed, because this is major when you're talking about K through 12 and higher education. We should be involved in all the community organizations where you can have a seat at the table to begin educating people on what's happening right here in front of us every day.
Ironically, though, they try to keep us off those boards, but there's no oppression, so we can't talk about that.
Mhm, mhm.
I mean, it's ludicrous, right? What this type of legislation is actually stating and doing. And Dr. Mason, in one of our local counties, the governor just replaced 3 or 4 individuals on the school board, handpicked by him, because he said that they were doing things that he didn't approve of, that he didn't like. And Florida is a challenging place. I mean, we were all over the news with the pandemic, with, you know, sending kids to school, not having mask mandates. The governor believes that all of this works together, but the America he's selling is not the America that's currently in existence.
Mhm.
And that for me is pretty challenging. We fully anticipate a resignation of faculty at all levels, K through 12 and at the university level, who are going to find, or who are going to say it's simply too difficult to teach here. Future generations, I mean, I have small children. I have a 7-year-old and a 10-year-old. They're not going to learn what I learned in school that's related to history, that talks about civil rights, that talks about maybe even President Obama. I mean, I don't know how the language is going to change, but we see that there's also a connection between various governors around the country and book publishers. So they are also pulling out information that they don't think people really need to know about, because that makes us woke and is leading to us becoming more and more divisive as a nation instead of unifying us. They don't see that eliminating our history is what's making us divisive.
One of the point I wanted to make to what you're saying in terms of the infrastructure being already in place. In the state of Michigan, all 15 public universities were granted by legislation law to be able to supervise and authorize charter schools to operate. And so that is another planned legislation, which was a Republican agenda going back again, like I said, 30 years ago, that's playing real time. And so what you're saying in terms of higher education, since here in Michigan, most public universities will authorize charter schools K through 12 to operate, they have it already in place where they can make it happen real quick, real time. It's very scary.
I had another, well, if no one else has any thoughts on this before moving forward, if so, go ahead.
I think we have someone who has stuff.
I did. I taught in a predominantly white private school. I was a history teacher. And one of the first phrases I would teach my students, there's no such thing as all or every, is that, you know, the elephant being in the room with President Obama being elected in this past election. You can't assume that all and every are going to be happy with this one event. It doesn't represent everybody. I think is with young people now, they become so inundated that, okay, we have a Black female vice president. So this represents everybody's thought, when again, that's a moment in history. And understanding that this is just one part of a human experience, in that there's so many things that have made up a human experience, and that there's no such thing as all or every. And having that discourse, I can remember when the OJ verdict happened. I went to school here in Georgia. They brought 40 police officers to search every Black male because they were so afraid, but they couldn't have a conversation because they were mad at the verdict. And now we're afraid to have conversations again because, okay, we just had a Black president, we have a Black female vice president, and understanding this doesn't represent all. Again, it's an experience, in that we could have an Italian president, we had a Catholic president, and people were up in arms. And at one point in this time, we had a Catholic president, and people now just don't know how to have a conversation anymore.
I wholeheartedly agree. And the conversations will be off to the side. The true conversations, like you have faculty who are asking, who are the true abolitionists at the institution? Who are the people where you can actually have a real conversation about what's going on, and you don't have to filter, you don't have to censor what you're saying or what you're experiencing, with the thought that you could lose your job over talking about your own experiences that are they're personal to you. You could lose your job if a student, and this is the hard part, they fully expect plants, molds in our classes to kind of agitate conversations to see if they can push us to that point. That's horrific. Because
Well, I
what are
guess
you
I'm
going to
going to be
do?
arrested. I'm going to be arrested. I think
Nobody
I,
wants to be arrested. We have
Okay.
families to support. I mean,
you know, in my leadership class, where I'm working with aspiring principals and superintendent, I have a lot of, the vast majority of them are white females that's in the class. In our schools, in public schools here in the state of Michigan, the vast majority of those instructors are Caucasian. We have an implicit bias course that's required through the state of Michigan that all employees have to take as a part of your employment at the state level, if you're a state employee or a public school. And that course in itself is having everyone to kind of take a look at your own biases as it relates to how does that have an impact on children and on society. Now I'm hearing this, I think it's going to be rolled back as a mandate that you take this implicit bias course and understand who you are and what you are imparting to others.
what we saw with the Trump administration pulling back on training, that they didn't want, they weren't going to fund DEI training across the nation. This is simply an extension of that, because they put the statute not just in the class to affect the classroom, it's affecting all of our employees. So at new employee orientation, that's going to now limit what you can present during orientation. It's going to limit what you can talk about. We're doing a manager series right now. I teach on microaggressions. I have to rethink my entire lesson with people because we talk about implicit biases. But the legislation says I'm not supposed to say that implicit bias is everywhere, that everybody, myself included, has implicit bias. Because we live in a post-racial society where none of those things are supposed to matter any longer. And I don't know how to wrap my head around that. I'll be completely honest with you. This is a struggle. And we do see some faculty who are choosing not to teach classes that really address this kind of stuff. So in sociology and criminal justice, in many of our global and sociocultural classes where patriarchy, for instance, is something that is infused into much of what we study. But faculty are afraid because we don't have any guidance, because the Board of Governors said, we're not giving you any guidance for a year, go figure it out on your own. We don't even know the process yet of how complaints are lodged, who's going to listen to those complaints, who is the arbiter, who's going to make the decision as to whether or not a student's claim that we made them feel uncomfortable is substantiated. This is all over the state. This isn't limited to our institution. No one is getting guidance. And we probably won't have any guidance until the litigation is over. So it's coming, y'all. That's all I can tell you. It's coming.
Mhm.
It's here. It's not going away.
No.
And you should expect more like this across the entire country.
Very scary.
It
Very
is
scary.
scary. It's like we've gone back, 60 years.
Yeah.
Gone
Or
backwards. Or more, yes.
Mhm. Mhm.
Dr. Blanford, do you have any closing thoughts? Because we've gone past our time.
Oh no,
Oh my
you're good. We
gosh.
still got 15 minutes.
Oh, do we?
Okay.
Yeah,
Oh,
we
okay,
changed.
cool.
We changed from
Oh.
60 to 75. So you're good.
Oh,
I
okay.
didn't
We're
even know
good.
that. I was thinking, oh my gosh, what a somber end to this. It's but I'm glad that we're engaging in this dialogue, and I know for me, just on a personal note, and you talk about the way my whole reason, I like writing. I really, really, really enjoy writing, and I enjoy researching. But my whole purpose for deciding to teach was so that I could engage in dialogue on these uncomfortable subjects to some. That was kind of my reason for saying no. And even the courses that I chose to teach, it was kind of the same thing, well, and I'm also thinking in terms of like my lived experiences, but like Dr. Vincent has said, it's completely different, and it's almost a dichotomy to be told that for my lived experiences to be invalidated and for them to be questioned, and that's hard for me, as a person who is committed to her students, as a person who I can have 150 students and I will still know students legitimately by name and tell them if they miss class. Like I miss you, you're okay, and to know that my main reason, or one of my main reasons for getting involved and choosing to go into the classroom could very well be my undoing, or I have to completely shift what I'm doing, and even to think about that there may be molds planted in our classes to see if they can trip us up. I mean, that is insane, because then there's like a level of angst, and it's hard. It's hard to be comfortable in the classroom if you go to that classroom every week thinking there may be someone there literally that is trying to set me up or to get me to endorse a particular ideology. It's just I didn't, and perhaps it's me being naive. I'm I'm very much so an optimist in all things. All things. I'm the optimist. So perhaps it's the optimism in me, but it's a bit disheartening to know that this is where we're headed and that it's likely going to get worse. I have a 5-year-old and a 6-year-old, and for me, and Dr. Vincent and I have discussed this as well, and thinking about placing them in school, and knowing full well that if they're in someone's classroom, that what they're learning may very well be whitewashed.
Mhm.
or saying, "How this isn't important anymore." You know, that's a very scary thought for me, to know that there's this ideology being pushed that we live in a post-racist society, knowing my experiences, knowing the experiences of my Black husband and my kids and my family. It's I'm very rarely am I awe-stricken, but literally it's I'm surprised. I'm a little saddened by this. And so our idea was, well, we know, again, we're kind of all over the place because we're still working to kind of try to figure this out, but at least to kind of make people aware, and to also, just to kind of start thinking about what could potentially happen, or what may very well be to come. And it's really, really, it's disheartening. And and even from the perspective of not just in the classroom, but in a DEI space, being told that, because one of the information that we got from the university also said that we cannot discriminate against a person by their race or gender or color in order to achieve DEI efforts. That to me was like, I'm sorry, what? It's like, how did those two, how can those two coexist, right? They're like dichotomies. We're saying on one hand, oh no, we really want to advance DEI, but then on the other hand, we're saying, well, not at the cost of a particular race or gender. Because then I think, okay, are you really that concerned with DEI? It also, at least for me, and I can only speak for myself, it causes me to question a lot of things. A lot of things. It causes me to question, is this something that I want to do for the rest of my life? This causes me to question, at this point, is my greatest impact still in the classroom? Because I do really enjoy writing, but my sole mission has always been, no, I want to engage my students, and I want to have those difficult conversations. And especially for me, thinking in terms of, I teach criminal justice, and there are many of my students, some of them are going to become, police officers, or they're planning to become an attorney, and I think about the impact that they're going to have on everyday citizens. And that was my push for saying, no, I want to be in the classroom, because I want to have these difficult and uncomfortable conversations. So when they go out and they interact with citizens, with our paid tax dollars, that they may think about them being unconsciously biased, or the privilege that they benefit from, and how a particular person may be where they are because of privilege or oppression. So to have to wrap my mind around maybe not being able to discuss that, and what that means for not just my students, but what that also means for the citizens that they will be interacting with, is something I'm still trying to get my head around.
I mean, the good thing is that the legislation does not apply to research. I guess that's the good thing. It only applies to what's happening in the classroom. And to take it another step, they've also required now that we submit syllabi in advance, so that the general public can look through our syllabi. So there's a website you go to if you're teaching our undergraduate core curriculum, and the books have to be identified. The entire syllabus has to be ready a semester ahead of time, so that parents or students or legislators can go through them and search by keyword if we're talking about things that we're not supposed to be talking about according to the statute. So they're going to do this from all angles. This is not just a one arrow that they're throwing at us. They're throwing it from all different angles, from all different spaces. And I agree with Dr. Blanford. Because we teach in the same department and teach the same type of things, and I've been thrust into doing this DEI work. That was not my initial intent. I got assigned DEI after George Floyd was murdered. But I look around my office and I'm looking at books like The New Jim Crow, The Color of Law, Race Talk, White Fragility, White Out, this is what is all in my space. And now you're going to tell me the things that I know from that, the things that I have studied for 15 years. I can't just say it because my word isn't good enough anymore. They're telling us, explain to your students the epistemology of your discipline. You think my undergraduates can even say the word epistemology, let alone understand what we're talking about? Explain to your students your credentials, because maybe they don't know the difference between you have all these degrees and your doctorate versus what they see on TikTok and social media. Explain to your students how knowledge is created in your discipline in order for you to have a conversation about race or gender in America. And I just don't get it. I mean, we'll do it. We will comply with state statute because that's what you have to do to keep your job. But I don't understand it. And I'm terrified of where this will go in the future. We have some comments in the chat. Adult learning theory says that adults learn based on drawing on past experiences. Of course, that means this law is not allowing for learning to take place based on connecting personal experiences. Yes, absolutely. Our personal experiences don't matter. Our influence on others, that is our impact. But is this a way to reduce our impact? And how much of this is all related to the fact that, yes, we had a Black president and we have a Black female vice president, and this is one way to try and prevent that from continuing. Eliminate the history, eliminate what you can talk about. Don't talk about the advances that have been made or why it's so important that we have a female vice president at this point in time. This is a critical juncture in our history. Why is that important? Well, most likely the goal here is to remove all of that, to eliminate all of those things, right? And our children, our young children in particular, are growing up in a world where all they know is a Black president and a Black female vice president. They've never seen anything else. It's totally contrary to what the rest of us have experienced. But if we don't fight legislation like this, the kids will never know what happened before because it's not going to be in the textbooks anymore. It'll be a figment of our imagination that we can only talk about. We can only share it through storytelling, but there's not going to be anything there to use as substance to prove that what we're saying happened. I mean, this is where you have to have a discussion with students on what's fake news and what's not. So did the civil rights movement actually happen? Did the Holocaust actually happen? Because that could just be conspiracy theory. That could be fake news according to various individuals. So it really is turning education on its head. It's turning education upside down. And I don't know how we get past it, to be honest with you.
I think it's continue to be true to yourself. That's so much important. When you think about our forefathers who went through horrendous times back in the Jim Crow days, and they still were writing their books. They still were communicating the messages. And that did not stop them. All type of laws of Black codes were being established for 50 or 60 years after slavery, and it continues to be so now. You have to be true to yourself and work around those persons who are trying to hold us back.
You would just think in 2022 that we don't have to deal with that anymore. I mean, they've censored the 1619 project. It cannot be taught in any school in the state of Florida. And that's just one tiny little example of all the other things that they are going to censor. Anything that speaks to a different truth, if you will, that comes from a different point of departure, how somebody else understands history or why things were done that way. Because they don't like the idea in the book, they've censored it altogether. I thought we were past that in this country. I really did. And that's my own naivete. But it's showing it's showing that the world is going to get worse. The country is going to get worse, not better. When we start hiding information and you can't talk freely about things, it's going to get worse. There's no way it can get better, especially now if I'm an agent of the state by virtue of working here. Now I'm really limited in what I can say and what I can't say. We were concerned about this session being recorded. Like, what are they going to do with that? And I mean, in 2022, almost 2023, our right to freedom of speech has gotten much narrower than it was 4 years ago. I can tell Dr. Tyson is not amused with this topic.
I have so many thoughts. It's ridiculous.
I'll tell you one thing, don't move to Florida.
It makes it harder. I've been struggling with the concept of getting back into academia or not, and it's just like with stuff like this, it heightens the desire, but then it's like the foolishness is there too.
Mhm.
So, but at the same time, it's just like you said earlier, all they know now is TikTok.
Yeah.
So really having people in place that could really teach some foundational stuff would really make a difference. So I don't know.
As long as it's taught from a purely objective place that doesn't make any of your students feel uncomfortable, or that they have benefited from the privilege of their white ancestors before them.
Right.
As long as you don't say anything like that, then you'll be fine in the classroom.
Even though we still can't go to certain places because we're not allowed. But hey, no one sees that.
No.
Mhm.
Can't drive through certain parts of the state at night.
Right.
That's for sure. Not if you expect to make it to the other destination
Right.
during the next day.
Yeah, that's really real.
Yeah.
That's real.
And I think the world 2008, 2016, and especially in 2016, and then 2020, the conversation has changed to where what we used to be able to say, we can't say. How we can interact with each other, we can't, because some will say, you all should be happy because, you know, you all got a black, and it's like, there's a million other things going on, but this one thing doesn't represent 200-300 years of hardships of our ancestors and all these things. Oh, we got a black female, you all should be happy. What do you all have to complain about? And it's like, again, that's just one instance. And then you look at the election of 2016, that has forever rewritten American history. When I taught in high school, we couldn't even have the conversation. And as if you had it, you had to be friendly, a little more nicer to Trump and present the alternate side, but you could never present a liberal side.
No.
Is when you give a Black History project. You could do a project on Muhammad Ali, but you couldn't do one on Barack Obama. You could do one on Oprah, but you couldn't do one on Rosa Parks. You couldn't do one on Malcolm X. It's like, we're picking and choosing who's the safe conversation instead of, let's just have a conversation that one Black individual does not represent everybody. And I think that we've kind of just gone back to President Obama represents every Black person. So we should just be happy and stop complaining. Vice President Harris represents every last Black woman. You all should be happy. What do you all got to fuss about? You finally have a woman. And it's like corporate America, higher education, all of these other things that are happening to women of color. In this one election doesn't rewrite all the wrongs. And it's not gonna write all the future just because of this one instance.
As long as we entertaining everybody, we okay. It's when we have a mind, that's the
Hey,
problem.
that has always been our problem. Throw a ball, entertain,
Yeah.
and we're safe. Educate, and we're a threat.
Mhm. Mhm.
Which on the positive, I'm like Dr. Blanford, I'm always a positive guy. That shows you the power that we have as a people. If we were to ever become cohesive and really rise up, the fact that they're scared of us.
Mhm. Mhm.
So
Wholeheartedly agree. Dr. Sykes, I agree. And it's interesting. I was reading an article recently, and they were comparing this legislation to like the anti-literacy laws of old, and just the parallels there. And it's interesting that you mentioned the threat of having that knowledge. It's powerful. It really, really is. And people are intimidated by that, so yeah, if we could ever really just unite, kind of move in the same direction, and it's great if you're a ball player, or it's great if you're an artist, but there are so many other things that you can do that are just as impactful, and perhaps even more. So also just changing the narrative around education, I think, is important too, because I don't think we have enough people encouraging. I have two young sons. I said this already, and both of them are relatively, they're big. I'm tall. Their father is tall, and so people see them immediately, and they're like, "Oh my gosh!" Or, "Do you have them in football, or are they playing basketball?" And I'm like, "No, they're not." And if that's an interest that they develop later on in life, then I'm totally fine with that. But imagine if we, as a people, spent or gave the same amount of energy we did to Little League football.
Mhm. Mhm.
Mm.
Yes. Yes.
We're
Mhm.
from the time they're 3 or 4, we have them going out and they're playing, and we're buying equipment, and not that that's necessarily a bad thing, but imagine if we reframed how we thought of education, and what that could do for us individually, what that could do for us as far as our families and our communities, and
As
then
a
said that
people.
same energy, yes, and the same energy that we're spending, and that same money, maybe that could be reallocated elsewhere. I think there's something to be said there.
Yeah.
But again, hey, they're gonna push for us to run a ball, or to dance, or to hold a mic, and not necessarily to read a book, or to write, or to really become engaged. And it's really unfortunate.
We are over time. This has been a really great conversation. I want to thank both Dr. Carleen Vincent Robinson, Dr. Candace Emmons Blanford. This has been very great. I think it's been a much needed conversation. And I just want to charge everybody to keep the conversation going with someone. The more we talk about it, the less uncomfortable it is, and the more it spreads and brings awareness.
Well, thank you for giving us the opportunity. You guys have spoken some real words of wisdom. You've given us some jewels to take back to our institution as well, and you've fortified us so that we can continue to do this kind of work here in South Florida.
Thank you so much.
University? What university are you affiliated with?
Florida
FIU.
International University.
University of?
Florida International University. We
okay.
are the 4th largest public institution in the United States. So we've got 57,000 students. That's 57,000 students whose education now is going to be modified, is going to be altered because of this type of legislation. But we're gonna fight the power. We're gonna
stay the course.
Positive note.
We're gonna stay the course and make a difference. There you go.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's a better way of saying that. Well, thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful night.
You all
Thank
too.
you so
Thank
much.
you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.